So today we shall discuss about the elasticity of supply. So I think in the previous chapters we have discussed the elasticity of demand. So now we are going to discuss about from the supply side. So the elasticity of supply. So what does this elasticity of supply means? It is nothing but the measure. So it is a relative measure of the responsiveness, so degree of responsiveness of quantity supplied of a commodity to the change in its price. So the degree of responsiveness of the quantity supplied of a commodity in relation to the change in its price. So what degree of responsiveness happens in the quantity supply of a commodity to the change in its price? So that is elasticity of supply. So it can be specifically defined as a percentage change in the quantity supplied of a product divided by the percentage change in price that is causing the change in quantity supply. So elasticity of supply is nothing but the percentage change in the quantity supply of a product divided by the percentage change in price. So that is elasticity of supply. So when we talk about elasticity of supply, we can see the elastic side of the supply, the inelastic side of the supply. So what is all about elastic supply? So elastic supply occurs when a small fall in price leads to relatively large contraction in supply. So when a small amount or little amount of price has fallen, which leads to a relatively large contraction in supply, so which leads to a large decline in the supply, that is elastic supply. And conversely, when there is a small rise in the prices, it leads to a relatively big extension in the supply. So when there is a rise, a small rise or increase in the prices of a commodity, there is a big increase in the supply of a commodity. So that is in case of elastic supply. So a small fall or a small rise in the prices leads to a huge increase or decrease in the supply of a commodity, that is elastic supply. So the degree of responsiveness to the change in price is very high in quantity supply. So when we talk about responsiveness, we are talking about the amount of quantity that is supplied when there is a change in price takes place. So when there is a small rise or small fall in the price of a commodity, the quantity supply or the reaction or the effect on quantity supply is very huge. Or in both the cases, when there is a fall or when there is a rise in the price. So little fall or a small rise in the price leads to a large increase in supply or a big decrease in the supply, that is elastic supply. So opposite to that, we have inelastic supply. So inelastic supply is nothing but a situation where big fall in the price, so price has fallen in huge amount, but it is leading to a very small contraction in supply. So the degree of responsiveness in quantity supply is very less comparing with the fall or the rise in the price. So conversely to this line, when there is a big rise in the price level, it leads to a relatively small extension or increase in the supply. So there is a big fall or a big rise in the price of a commodity, but the quantity supply is, it is very small, or the increase in amount is very small, or the decrease in amount is very small. There is inelastic supply. So when there is a big fall in the price leading to a relatively very small decline in supply, that is inelastic supply. And when there is a big rise So we are talking about price increasing, but it is leading to a relatively small extension. So even if there is a big increase in the price, the producers will produce very less amount of quantity of commodity, that is inelastic supply. So that is the two cases of elasticity of supply. So we can see in through the diagram. So this is figure 7 is the diagram representation for elastic supply, and figure 8 is representing inelastic supply. So let us look at figure 7, which is elastic supply. So on the x-axis we are measuring quantity, and on the y-axis we are measuring price, and O is the origin. So we are drawing SS as the supply curve, which is sloping upward, because supply curve usually slopes upward towards the right. So in figure 7, at OP1 price, quantity supply is OQ1 in figure 7. And in figure 8, at OP1 price, quantity supplied is ON1. So price level is same in both the cases, figure 7 and figure 8. So when there is a rise in the prices, so now the price has changed from OP1 to OP2. So price has increased to OP1 in both the figures. So the increase in price is same in both the figures. But let us see what is the difference in quantity supply when price has increased in both the cases. So when there is an increase in the price, in figure 7, the quantity supply has increased to OQ2. So from OQ1, it has increased to OQ2. And even in figure 8, when there is an increase in prices, the quantity supply also increased from ON1 to ON2. But the increase in figure 7 is greater than the increase in figure 8, meaning Q1, Q2 is greater than N1, N2. So we can draw, or we can conclude that, figure 7 is more elastic in supply than figure number 8, because when there is a increase in the price level, the quantity supply here is greater than the quantity supply in figure 8, meaning to say Q1, Q2 is greater than N1, N2. So we have seen that price has increased in the same level, but the quantity of supply is greater here than N1, N2. So figure 7 is representing elastic supply, and figure 8 is representing inelastic supply. So again, this is the example, the extreme situation of elasticity of supply. So this figure 9 is representing perfectly inelastic supply, and then figure 10 represents perfectly elastic supply. So in perfectly inelastic supply, the supply curve will be, parallel to y-axis, or it is, vertical straight line touching the x-axis in case of perfectly inelastic supply. And then in case of perfectly elastic supply, the supply curve is horizontal to the x-axis. So a supply curve perpendicular to the, or vertical, sorry. So when supply curve is vertically, straight upward, it is indicating that, no matter how low or how high price changes, supply remains constant. Supply is the same at various price level. So at different price level, at different price level, supply remains the same. So there is perfectly inelasticity in the supply when supply curve is vertically straight line. And when supply curve is horizontal to the x-axis, it is indicating that a small change in the price, will lead to a huge change in the quantity supply. So a little or very tiny or small change in the prices will lead to a huge amount of change in the quantity supply. That is perfectly elastic supply. Perfectly elasticity and then perfectly inelastic supply. So these are the two extreme cases of elasticity of supply. Again, in the next topic that we have is we shall see the factors determining elasticity of supply. So we have discussed in the previous class about the factors that is determining supply. So it will be different when it comes to the factors that is determining elasticity of supply. So basically there are 5 factors that is determining the elasticity of supply. So this elasticity of supply, they play an important role in determining prices of products. To what extent price of a product will rise following the increase in demand depends on the elasticity of supply. So as I have said, elasticity of supply plays an important role in determining the prices of various products. So as I have just mentioned, to what extent the price of a product will rise when there is an increase in the demand for that product is will depend on the elasticity of supply of that particular product. So the greater the elasticity of supply of a product, the less the rise in its price when demand for it increases. So when demand increases, how will the price of a product is determined? Depend on the elasticity of supply. That is what it means. So the greater the elasticity of supply of a product, then the less the rise in its price when demand for it increases. So that is why it is the elasticity of supply which is playing an important role in determining the prices of various products. So we shall see one by one what are the various factors that is determining the elasticity of supply. So first up we have changes in marginal cost of production. So when we talk about marginal cost or marginal product, marginal would mean the additional amount of cost that is incurred for producing additional unit of product. That is marginal cost. So what does it say in changes in marginal cost of production? So elasticity of supply for a commodity depends on the ease with which increases in output can be obtained without bringing about rise in cost of production. So this elasticity of supply for a commodity depends on the ease with which increase in output. We are increasing the output without bringing about rise in the cost of production. So if with the increase in production, marginal cost of production goes up, we are taking a situation where we are increasing our production. So while increasing our production, if marginal cost of production is also increasing, then elasticity of supply to that extent would be less. So elasticity is less in that case. When we increase our production, at the same time marginal cost of production is also increasing or it goes up, then elasticity in that case is less. There is less elasticity. So we can study this in both the short run and the long run. So remember, in the short run we are considering that only the variable factor can be increase or decrease, and in the long run all the factors of production can be changed or varied. So in the short run with some factors of production being fixed. So we are fixing factors of production. Some of them are fixed now in the short run. So in that case, an increase in the amount of the variable factor. So variable factor is increased, then it will eventually cause diminishing marginal return. So we have seen in the long run the law of variable proportion, or in that law of variable proportion we have witnessed that diminishing marginal returns. And in the short run, when that diminishing marginal returns happens, as a result of that, with the expansion of output, the marginal cost of production rises. So this causes supply of a commodity in the short run less elastic. So in the short run, it is because of the marginal or diminishing marginal returns. And because of these diminishing marginal returns, in our expansion of our output, the marginal cost of production rises. So the cost of production to produce a product increases. That is why the supply of commodity in the short run is less elastic. However, in the long run, that is not the case. The firms can increase the output by varying all factors. So factors can vary here. And also the new firms can enter the industry in the long run and thereby add to the supply of a commodity. Therefore, the long run supply curve of commodity is more elastic than that of the short run. So when it comes to changes in marginal cost of production, just remember that in the short run, elasticity of supply is less, and in the long run, it is more elastic comparing with the short run. In the short run, it is less elastic because of the diminishing marginal returns, and because of that diminishing marginal returns, the marginal cost of production rises. So that is the reason why we have less elasticity in the short run. Again, in the increasing cost industry, that is the industry, increasing cost industry, that is an industry which experiences increases in cost, when industry expands through the entry of new firms, the long run supply curve is upward sloping. So in the case of increasing cost industry, we will have a supply curve that is upward sloping, and in the case of constant cost industry, we will have a perfectly elastic supply curve, and in the decreasing cost industry, we will have downward sloping supply curve. So increasing cost industry, why do we have upward sloping supply curve? As I have mentioned, in the increasing cost industry, we will have an upward sloping supply curve. So increasing cost industry means it is the industry which experiences increase in cost, when industry expands or when a new firm enters. So in the long run supply curve is upward sloping. So it is elastic in supply. It is more elastic. In case of constant cost industry, what happens? So in the long run supply curve is perfectly elastic when we talk about constant cost industry. Why? Because in this case, the increases in the industrial output. So while increasing the output, the increase in industrial output can be obtained at the same average and marginal cost. So price of a commodity does not change with the expansion in output. So price of a commodity does not change when we increase the output of an industry, and in that case we will have a perfectly elastic supply curve. So constant cost industry would mean while increasing our output or product, the cost of production does not increase. In that case, we will have a perfectly elastic supply curve. The next and the last case that we have is decreasing cost industry. So in this this decreasing cost industry, the long run supply curve is downward sloping and has therefore a negative elasticity of supply. So in this case, we will have a negative, elasticity of supply. Why? This is because in the case of decreasing cost industry, expansion or increasing of production in the industry actually brings down the cost of production, and therefore additional output is forthcoming at a lower supply price. So that is the reason why we have downward sloping or a negative elasticity of supply in decreasing cost industry. So the next factor that is determining elasticity of supply is response of the producers or firm. So besides the change in the cost of production, as we have seen, the elasticity of supply, for a product depends on the responsiveness of the producers to change in its price. So let us say if the producers do not respond positively to the increase in price, the quantity supplied of a product will not increase as a result of rise in its price. So the usual or a rational producer would increase their supply when there is a rise in the price. But if the producer is not very responsive, or he is not positively responsive to the rise in price, even if there is an increase in the prices, he will not supply more. So it depends on the responsiveness of the producers whether supply will be more or supply will be less. It is not compulsory, it is not necessarily supply will rise when price rises. It depends on the response of the producers. That is what it means. For example, a profit maximizing producers will increase the quantity supply of a product following the rise in its price. So there is a rational and a profit maximizing producer. But however, producers do not always exhibit profit maximizing behavior, as is generally assumed in economic theory. And because of that, supply is not increased in response to the rise in price. So it is not necessary that a producer will increase their supply when there is a rise in the prices. The third is availability of the production facilities for expanding output. So number 3, the extent to which the producers will raise supply of the product will also depend on the availability of productive facilities and inputs required for the production of goods. Price is increasing or demand is increasing for a particular product, but if the production houses or producers or firm does not have a abundance, or they do not have proper facilities, inputs, resources, then even if price is rising, they will not be able to expand their output. So the supply also depends upon the availability of production facilities or inputs, resources for expanding the output. It is not necessary that when the price rise, the firm or production will increase. It will also depend on the availability of the production facilities, infrastructure, resources, inputs, raw materials, etc. That is what it means by availability of production facilities for expanding output. Next is possibilities of substitution of one product for the other. So the change in quantity supplied of a product, because of the change, following the change in its price, depends on the possibilities of substitution of one product for others. So let's take example of wheat and pulses. So wheat and pulses, they can be substituted. So if market price of wheat rises, what will happen? The farmers will try to shift resources such as land, fertilizers, away from the other products such as pulses in our example, and they will devote them to production of wheat. So they will reduce the production of pulses and increase their production of wheat, because both these products are substitute goods. So the greater the extent of the possibilities of shifting the resources from the other products to wheat production, the greater will be the elasticity of supply of that. So the greater the substitution level, then the greater will be the elasticity of supply. Again, let me repeat, the greater the extent of the possibility to substitute or to shift resources from other products to another products, let us say in our example from pulses to wheat, the greater will be the elasticity of that supply, the greater elasticity of supply for that product. So here we can shift our resources from pulses to wheat easily. So here it will be a case of elasticity, because we can easily substitute or we can easily shift resources from production of pulses to production of wheat. So is the possibilities or the extent of possibilities of shifting of resources from the other products to wheat production, the greater the elasticity of supply of wheat. And the last point that we have is the length of time or time horizon. So the elasticity of supply of a product, they also depends on that length of time during which producers have to respond to a given change in price of a product. So it depends on the time or time horizon that a producers have to respond to the change in the prices of a product. So generally, the longer the time producers get to make adjustment for changing the level of output in response to the change in price, the greater the response of output. That is the greater elasticity of supply. So if a producer gets a longer time to adjust, then the greater will be the supply. And if a producer has less time, then the lesser elasticity of supply will happen. So from the viewpoint of the influence of the length of time elasticity supply, we distinguish between the time periods. So basically we have 3 time periods that we can distinguish. Number 1 is market period or very short run. Number 2 is short run, and number 3 is long run. So the market period is a very short period, and during this no more production is possible. Therefore, market period supply curve is a vertical straight line, which means perfectly inelastic. So in case of market period, it is perfectly inelastic or has a very steep slope that is inelastic. In the short run, firms can change output by changing the amount of only variable factors. So short run supply curve is somewhat elastic. So short run, it is somewhat elastic because they can change their variable factors. So, but in the long run, since firms can adjust all factors of production and also new firms can enter or leave the industry, in the long run supply curve is therefore more elastic. In the long run, the supply curve is more elastic than the short run supply curve. So that is all the factors that is determining the elasticity of supply. Changes in the marginal cost of production, response of the producers, availability of the production facilities for expanding output, possibilities of substitution of one product for the other, and the length of time or time period. And when we talk about time horizon, we have distinguished 3 time periods. There is market period, short run, and the long run. So in the market period, it is very inelastic. Short run, it is more elastic, somewhat elastic than the market period, and in the long run it is very elastic.